The idea of the basic structure. Another fundamental idea is the idea of the basic structure of a well ordered society. This idea is introduced so as to formulate and present justice as fairness as having an appropriate unity. Along with the idea of the original position, so it is needed to complete other ideas and to order them into perspicuous whole. The idea of the basic structure may be seen in that light. So, the basic structure of society is the way in which the main political and social institutions of society fit together into one system of social cooperation, and the way they assign basic rights and duties and regulate the division of advantages that arises from social cooperation over time. The political constitution, with an independent judiciary, the legally recognized forms of property, and the structure of the economy, as well as the family in some form, all belong to the basic structure. So, when we talk about the basic structure, we basically talk about the way in which the whole society is organized. What are the different social and political institutions, how they are organized, and how they respond to each other. For example, today in our country, what we have is that judiciary, as the Chief Justice of India is the topmost agency of the country, and that everybody and the chief justices and the Supreme Court's decision is the last decision upon which you cannot appeal anymore. So it's the final decision, it has the final say. And then there's the executive, there's legislature, and then there are different political societies, there are independent bodies. How in our basic structure we have private schools, private colleges, government schools, government colleges. Then we have some public agencies, we have some private agencies. For example, when we talk about transport, it's not that all the transport is completely publicized. There are some private companies which also take care of the transport system. So this is what the basic structure is. And also the family, okay, one's family also includes, is a part of the basic structure. The basic structure is um, the basic structure is the background social framework within which the activities of associations and individuals take place. A just basic structure secures what we may call background justice. So basically, we are getting it right that the basic structure is like the background of everything, where every action is taking place. So basic structure is like the ground on which everything is standing apart. Okay, everything, all the buildings on the foundations is standing. Basic structure is that ground. One main feature of justice as fairness is that it takes the basic structure as the primary subject of political justice. It does so in part because the effects of the basic structure on citizens' aims, aspirations, and characters, as well as on their opportunities and their ability to take advantage of them, the pervasive and present form, the beginning of life. Our focus is almost entirely on the basic structure as the subject of political and social justice. So, one important feature of justice as fairness is that basic structure plays a very important and almost a primary role to ensure proper justice. Since justice as fairness starts with a special case of the basic structure, its principles regulate this structure and do not apply directly to or regulate internally institutions and associations within society. Firms and labor unions, churches, universities, and the family are bound by constraints arising from the principles of justice, but these constraints arise indirectly from just background institutions within which associations and groups exist and by which the conduct of their members is restricted. So, all that is happening, the basic structure basically regulates the whole justice system of a particular organization. Okay, and it, since it starts, when we talk about justice and we talk about political justice, it starts with the case of basic structure, the principles of the basic structure, how the basic structure is being formed. For example, let's talk about a nation or a group wherein there is no judiciary, there is no executive, there is one just legislative, the one governing body that is making the laws, that is maintaining that the laws are being followed, and in the breach of any of those laws is also punishing the other person. Okay, so in such a case, there is no institutionalization of different powers. Okay, what happens is the basic structure is very legislative oriented. The basic structure is favoring just one group. It is giving unusual powers to just one group of people, and that group of people is also making the laws, also ensuring that the laws are maintained, and also punishing somebody who is not following the laws properly. So in such a case, the basic structure is not justified, is not fair. Okay. So yes, basic structures do not directly but indirectly regulate everything that is happening, okay, around in the society. For example, while churches can excommunicate heretics, they cannot burn them. This constraint is to secure liberty of conscience. Universities cannot discriminate in certain ways. This constraint is to help to establish fair equality of opportunity. Okay, so like what when we talk about, churches, they can excommunicate heretics, they cannot burn them. This is to secure liberty of conscience, that every person has a conscience, and according to the conscience the society is also governed. Universities cannot discriminate in certain ways. Now today, universities cannot take admission solely on the basis of somebody's, social situations like caste, creed, gender, race, or anything in that way. There's a certain way, there's a certain procedure through which universities take admissions. So this is done so that everybody gets a fair equality of opportunity. Parents are equal citizens and have equal basic rights, including the right of property. They must respect the rights of their children, which the latter have as prospective citizens, and cannot, for instance, deprive them of essential medical care. So now, even when we talk about parents, they have certain duties to follow, children have certain rights. Okay, while they are living with their parents, the children have right to demand from their parents, the basic healthcare system, the basic healthcare that they need. Moreover, to establish equality between men and women in sharing the work of society, in preserving its culture, and in reproducing itself over time, special provisions are needed in family law so that the burden of bearing, raising, and educating children does not fall more heavily on women, thereby undermining their fair equality of opportunity. So today, when we talk about laws such as women also have the right to vote, women also have the right to, take up any job as they want, earn money, take care of the family. At the same time, they can hire cooks, they can keep maids. So all of these, okay, there are no restrictions on all of these things. So basically they are also a kind of family law. Okay, they may not be directly listed as family laws, but yes, they do assist in the making of the family. In, for example, especially a woman, for let's consider this, that from tomorrow, that women are denied, that they cannot, you know do any job. Okay, so that means that if that happens, the sole responsibility of raising the children rests solely upon the women. Then the men will just go out, earn, and they won't have any part in raising their children. That can be very much a case. One should not assume in advance that principles that are reasonable and just for the basic structure are also reasonable and just for institutions, associations, and social practices generally. While the principles of justice and fairness impose limits on these social arrangements within the basic structure and the associations and social forms within it are each governed by distinct principles in view of their different aims and purposes, and their peculiar nature and special requirements. Now, when we talk about the basic structure, of course there are some rules and regulations that the basic structure follows, but then within this basic structure there are local groups and institutions and associations that need their own system of governance. They cannot just rely on the system of the basic structure and achieve their political justice. So there are institutions within the basic structures that are called the local institutions, and those local institutions have their own local justice system. Justice as fairness is a political, not a general conception of justice. It applies first to the basic structure and sees these are the questions of local justice and also questions of global justice are as calling for separate consideration on their merits. So now the basic structure, when we talk about justice, there are basically three justices: the local justice, the global justice, So, the principles of justice to be followed directly by associations and institutions within the basic structure we may call principles of local justice. So, local justice basically applies to the local institutions within a basic structure. For example, today there's a hospital. Okay, now that hospital has its own infrastructure, the hospital has its own governance through which it will govern itself. It has its own laws and regulations to follow. It's not that it will be like directly way too much in confrontation with the basic structure, but yes, it may have some of those that are confronting with the basic structure's laws and justice. Although we have three levels of justice. Okay, so first is local justice, domestic justice, and then global justice. So local justice is principles applying directly to institutions and associations. Domestic justice is applying to the basic structure, and then there's a global justice which applies to the international law. So it first starts with the domestic justice. Okay, then it moves outwards to the global justice, and then it moves inward to local justice. The law of people have always been discussed elsewhere, so we're basically talking about kind of the hierarchy through which it has to be followed. So the first thing that anybody has to follow is the laws of the domestic justice, that is the basic structure, then of the global justice, and then of the local justice. No attempt will be made here to deal systematically with local justice. In general, principles for the basic structure constraint do, or limit but do not determine uniquely the suitable principles of local justice. Note that our characterization of the basic structure does not provide a sharp definition or criterion from which we can tell what a social arrangement or aspects thereof belong to it. Rather, note that our characterization of the basic structure does not provide a sharp definition or criterion from which we can tell what social arrangements or aspects thereof belong to it. Rather, we start with a loose characterization of what is initially a rough idea. Okay, so when we talk about the basic structure, it's not a very cut-to-cut boundaried thing that comes within it. So of course, the boundaries keep pushing, and it's a very flexible thing that we are talking about. As indicated above, we must specify the idea more exactly as seems best after considering a variety of particular questions. With this done, we then check how the more definite characterization coheres with our considered convictions on due reflection. The role of political conception of justice, however, is not to say exactly how these questions are to be settled, but to set out a framework or thought within which they can be approached. Were we to lay down a definition of the basic structure that draws sharp boundaries, not only would we go beyond what the rough idea could reasonably contain, but we would also risk wrongly prejudging prejudging what more specific future conditions may call for, thus making justice as fairness and able to adjust to different social circumstances. So if when talking about the idea of basic structure, if we fixate on the boundaries too much, if we make them too rigid that we're not able to move them in further in future, we may risk the whole idea of the basic structure itself. And what will happen is that either till the time it will go on, and then it will suddenly fail. So there will be no chance to make any adjustments to it, to make any changes to it, but rather the whole system will completely fail rather than even staying a part of it. For our judgments to be reasonable, they must usually be informed by an awareness of those more specific circumstances. Finally, to anticipate, since justice's fairness presents itself as a possible focus of a reasonable overlapping consensus, and since the basic structure is the primary subject of justice, the boundaries and aspects of this structure must eventually be drawn and specified in ways that, if possible, at least permit, if not encourage, such a consensus. So generally stated, it is not evident what this condition requires, but these matters we try to answer as we take up a wider range of questions. Okay, so we have to specify the boundaries, we have to specify the basic structure, but we also have to take care that they are not too rigid and they can be changed in the future when the circumstances, and they will change. So when they change, we can also change with the change the basic structure. Now, limits to our inquiry. So before discussing the leftover six fundamental ideas, let us note some limits to our inquiry. Okay, so first has been indicated is that we must fix on the basic structure as the primary subject of political justice and leave aside questions of local justice. We view justice as fairness, not as a comprehensive moral doctrine, but as a political conception to apply to that structure of political and social institutions. So the first limit to our inquiry, that means we can say the first kind of how we are limited is when we're talking about political justice, we're talking about the basic structure. We have to limit ourselves only to the domestic justice, that is to the basic structure. We cannot yet really talk about the local justice and include in it, because when we say local justice, basically the institutions will have their own systems. We cannot interfere with that. The second limit is that we are concerned for the most part with the nature and content of justice for a well-ordered society. Discussion of this case is referred to in justice as fairness as ideal or strict compliance theory. Strict compliance means that everyone strictly complies with and so abides by the principles of justice. We ask in effect what a perfectly just or nearly just constitutional regime might be like, and whether it may come about and be made stable under the circumstances of justice, and so under realistic though reasonably favorable conditions. In this way, justice as fairness is realistically utopian. It probes the limit of the realistically practicable, that is, how far in our world a democratic regime can attain complete realization of its appropriate political values, democratic perfection, if you like. So, our second limit is that we are concerned for the nature and content of justice for a well-ordered society. Now, when theoretically we discuss about the nature and content of justice, as in, what should justice include in, how should it be accessible to everyone or not, when we talk about all of these things, we basically move away from its practical aspect, because we try to achieve something that is realistically utopian. Utopian is something that is completely perfect, absolutely perfect, but the problem with utopia is that it is not achievable. You cannot have utopia in your real life, because in real life, in practical life, there needs to have some or the other shortcomings to it. Okay, so justice cannot be realistically utopian. It will have its practical aim, it will have its practical approach, wherein there will be some shortcomings. Okay, so what we can do is we can try to be as practical as possible in our approach, so that we can attain a complete realization of its appropriate values, that is democratic perfection, if we may call so. But we have to be very, very practical in our approach. We focus on ideal theory because the current conflict in democratic thought is in good part a conflict about what conception of justice is most appropriate for a democratic society under reasonable favorable conditions. This is clear from what purposes we call the fundamental questions of political philosophy. Nevertheless, the idea of a well-ordered society should also provide some guidance in thinking about non-ideal theory, and so about difficult cases of how to deal with existing injustices. It should also help to clarify the goal of reform and to identify which wrongs are more grievous and hence more urgent to correct. So again, it's talking about the same thing, that on theory we talk about so many things that we need to achieve as far as justice is concerned, but the point is that we cannot theoretically achieve, okay, we cannot achieve what we have put down theoretically. So we have to be very, very practical in our approach. And also, the idea of a well-ordered society should provide some guidance in thinking about non-ideal theory, and so about difficult cases of how to deal with existing injustices. It should also help to clarify the goal of reform and to identify which wrongs are more grievous and more urgent to correct. So, ideally, on theory, things are very different. Okay, there can be matters which may need more urgent attention than other matters. So if we just look at, on theory, on paper, what came first has to be dealt with first. But what if it's not as urgent with more urgent as what came later on? A third limit or inquiry mentioned before is that we shall not here discuss the important question of the just relations between peoples, nor how the extension of justice's fairness to these relations illustrates the way in which it is suitably universe. I assume Kant's view is correct that a world government would either an oppressive global despotism or a fragile empire torn by frequent civil wars as separate regions and cultures tried to win their political autonomy. A just world order is perhaps best seen as a society of peoples, each people maintaining a well ordered and decent political regime, not necessarily democratic, but fully respecting basic human rights. So, the third limit to our inquiry is that we should not discuss the important question of just relations. Uh, uh, you know, we are not here to discuss about how a relationship between two people can be and has to be. So, we can't be universal in our approach. We can't have universality because every regime is different, it demands different thing, it asks a different thing, and also the people are different, the relation between people is different. So what we can aim is that a well ordered and decent regime, which may not be completely democratic, which is of course true that we cannot have something utopian that is 100% or absolutely like that. So it cannot be completely democratic but fully respecting basic human rights. So if we look for a threshold, if we look for some basic rights, so what we can ask for is that every person, the bare minimum is that they follow and respect the basic human rights. Other than that, every regime will have their some or the other different laws. So we cannot really call for universality in these things, but yes, respect and the following of basic human rights is something that we can always call for. In Justice's Fairness, the question of justice between peoples is postponed until we have an account of political justice for a well-ordered democratic society. Observe, though, that beginning with the justice of the basic structure does not imply that we cannot revise or account for a democratic society in view of that justice between people turn out to require. The two parts of a more complete political conception, the justice of domestic society as well as of the relations between societies, can be adjusted to each other in the course of working them out. So it's not that what we have decided once cannot be changed. Things can always be worked out between people. They will always keep on changing. Okay, so the relations between societies and the justice of domestic society can be adjusted to each other. So these two things can be adjusted, how societies have their relation among themselves and what is the justice of a domestic society, of the domestic justice that we talk about, the basic structure. Finally, I stress a point implicit in what we have said, namely that justice is fairness is not a comprehensive religious, philosophical, or moral doctrine, one that applies to all subjects and covers all values, nor is it to be regarded as the application of such a doctrine to the basic structure of society, as if this structure were merely another subject to which that comprehensive view is to be applied. Neither political philosophy nor justice's fairness is in that way applied to moral philosophy. Political philosophy has its own distinctive features and problems. Justice's fairness is a political conception of justice with the special case of the basic structure of a modern democratic society. In this respect, it is much narrower in scope than comprehensive philosophical and moral doctrines such as utilitarianism, perfectionism, and intuitionism, among others. It focuses on the political, which is part of the domain of the moral, in form of the basic structure, which is but a part of the domain of the moral. So, most importantly, that political philosophy is not an all-inclusive doctrine which covers all subjects, has to be applied to all beings, has all values, everything. Not political philosophy is not something that. What is political philosophy is we have already discussed in the first part that what are the four aims of political philosophy. But yes, it is not something that will completely cover and just get rid of all of our problems. Okay, and it is not something, political philosophy is not something that has to be applied to the basic structure. Basically, political philosophy has four aims, which we have talked about in the first part of the video. What are the four questions that political philosophy tries to answer, how it tries to settle the differences between people, how it shows people that what they have been through and what they are now and what scope they have in future.